What do you genuinely truly believe would happen deep within the intricate psychological and emotional fabric of others if on any given day, without fanfare, without dramatic pronouncements, without seeking permission or offering elaborate justifications, you simply left? I'm not necessarily referring solely to a physical disappearance, vanishing without a trace into the night. I'm speaking more profoundly, perhaps more disruptively, about disconnecting emotionally, consciously, deliberately, severing those often invisible yet incredibly strong, almost umbilical threads, the unspoken obligations, the ingrained expectations, the comfortable yet often suffocating unstated dependencies that intricately, perhaps even unconsciously, tie you to others, binding you within familiar yet potentially limiting relational systems. Have you ever truly paused amidst the relentless demands and expectations of connection to genuinely wonder what profound, perhaps seismic shifts might occur, both within the sanctuary of your own being and within the often turbulent inner worlds of those around you? If you made the deliberate, autonomous, perhaps even terrifying decision to step away, not driven by simmering hatred, not fueled by lingering resentment or a desire for revenge, but guided simply powerfully, perhaps even necessarily, by the fundamental, inviolable human need to be authentically with yourself, to reclaim your own sacred space, your finite energy, your sovereign narrative, your very essence. Most people tragically fail to grasp its subtle yet immense, almost unnerving power, but distance, particularly emotional distance created by conscious, deliberate withdrawal, possesses a strange, almost unsettling, deeply revealing potency. It's as if your deliberate act of moving out of their familiar, emotional, psychological, or even habitual orbit fundamentally, irrevocably disrupts a delicate, often unspoken, perhaps even unconscious equilibrium. The impact, the shockwaves extend far beyond the simple, understandable sentiment of merely missing you, of longing for your familiar presence. It delves into something much darker, much deeper, much more fundamental, something that inevitably touches upon, perhaps even painfully prods their most sensitive, most carefully guarded, often fiercely unacknowledged psychological fibers, their core wounds, their hidden insecurities, their deepest fears. Because when you consciously, deliberately choose to step away, when you make the sovereign decision to withdraw your energy, your attention, your reflection, you inevitably, unavoidably leave behind a void. And voids by their very nature are always universally, profoundly uncomfortable, often deeply destabilizing for the human psyche. Not necessarily, or even primarily because of what is physically missing in your absence, the tangible loss of your company or support, but more significantly, more revealingly because of what that sudden, stark absence starkly reveals in its wake, the hidden dependencies that quietly flourished in your presence, the unconscious projections that used your being as a convenient screen, the unspoken, perhaps even unrecognized needs that your presence perhaps conveniently, perhaps unknowingly masked, fulfilled, or simply kept dormant. And here emerges the truly intriguing, often paradoxical, psychological insight, one deeply resonant with Jungian thought. Your absence often doesn't hurt others, primarily because of what you inherently were to them, in some objective, quantifiable sense, because of your universally acknowledged good qualities or contributions. It hurts perhaps more accurately, more profoundly, more existentially, because of what they can no longer unconsciously project onto you. Make no mistake, let this truth sink in. People rarely, if ever, perceive you purely objectively as you authentically are in all your messy, complex, contradictory glory. More often than not, almost universally, they perceive you, interact with you, relate to you, through the complex, often profoundly distorting lens of how they need you to be, to fulfill their own intricate, often unconscious psychological requirements. You function often entirely unknowingly, perhaps even unwillingly, as the crucial, indispensable mirror in which they reflect, examine, validate, or deny their own unresolved insecurities, their hidden, sometimes shameful desires, their unvoiced, often demanding expectations, their disowned, feared shadow aspects. When you make the autonomous, sovereign decision to step away, to consciously withdraw that reflective, often accommodating surface, they are not simply left staring into the empty, perhaps lonely gap you left behind. They are far more jarringly, far more terrifyingly left confronting the shattered, fragmented, often deeply unflattering reflection of themselves that you simply, through your presence, your interactions, your very being used to hold up for them, perhaps providing a crucial sense of validation. They accept me, so I must be okay, a necessary feeling of stability. As long as they're here, my world feels secure, or even just a convenient welcome distraction from the often uncomfortable, challenging landscape of their own inner world, their own unaddressed issues. Think honestly, critically, courageously about your own experiences, both as the one leaving and the one left behind. How many times have you been told, perhaps with great, almost desperate emotional intensity, how important, how essential, how irreplaceable you are, how desperately they need you, how they simply couldn't do this or that, survive a crisis, manage their emotions, achieve a goal, feel whole, without your presence, your support, your guidance, your energy? But reflecting deeper now with this new lens of understanding, isn't it somewhat curious, perhaps even deeply suspicious, how those seemingly validating, ego-boosting words often appear upon closer, more objective examination to be fundamentally primarily more about their perceived needs, their anxieties, their dependencies, their fear of facing life alone, than genuinely authentically about your intrinsic qualities, your inherent value, your unique essence as a separate sovereign being. When you consciously, deliberately choose to distance yourself, whether physically by leaving a situation or emotionally by withdrawing your energy and validation, you effectively, often violently shatter that comfortable, perhaps necessary illusion, that convenient, distorting projection screen. And then, inevitably, predictably, they begin to feel something profound, something deeply unsettling, something they often struggle desperately to articulate, to understand, or even to consciously explain to themselves. It might manifest initially as raw confusion. Why would they do this? It makes no sense. Then perhaps morph into a gnawing, pervasive discomfort, an undefinable anxiety, simmer into unspoken, resentful anger. How dare they leave me abandon this ere they leave? Curdle into manipulative guilt-tripping. After everything I've done for them, they owe me, or descend into a pervasive, paralyzing fear. What will happen to me now? How will I cope without them? But underlying all these volatile, often confusing surface emotions often lies a far deeper, more terrifying, more existential question. One they rarely, if ever, dare to ask themselves directly, consciously. What is truly left of me if you are no longer there to reflect, validate, support, or simply contain the image I have carefully constructed of myself? It's profoundly unsettling, isn't it? Perhaps even terrifying. To contemplate the stark possibility that someone, perhaps many someones, might depend on you, cling to you, need you, not primarily out of genuine, reciprocal, freely chosen love, not out of an authentic soul, deep connection built on mutual respect and shared growth, but fundamentally, perhaps even exclusively, because you serve, however unknowingly, as the essential psychological crutch for something deeply uncomfortable, something fundamentally unresolved, something broken, something they desperately, fearfully don't want to face within themselves. And yet, Carl Jung, with his unflinching gaze into the human psyche, would argue an experience often confirms that this is the often unspoken, deeply uncomfortable, yet fundamentally crucial reality underpinning many, perhaps even most human relationships. We function not only as mirrors reflecting potentially illuminating aspects of each other, but often, far too often, unconsciously, habitually, as psychological crutches enabling dependencies, fostering stagnation, avoiding the necessary, albeit often painful work of individual growth and authentic self-reliance. When you make the courageous, often difficult decision to let go, when you consciously, deliberately choose to step away from a dynamic, a relationship, a system that no longer serves your own well-being, your authenticity, your growth, you inevitably, unavoidably force others to wobble, to potentially lose their familiar, perhaps precarious footing to confront, however unwillingly, however defensively, a truth they may have been diligently, perhaps desperately trying to ignore, perhaps for their entire lives. Their deep emotional dependence wasn't necessarily, or even primarily, on you, the actual complex, imperfect person, but rather far more significantly on the idea of you, on the specific, often limiting role you played within their psychological drama, on the convenient, perhaps flattering, or stabilizing projections you willingly or unwillingly carried for them. You were perhaps the rescuer, the caretaker, the responsible one, the scapegoat, the admirer, the container for their disowned parts. And then comes the real profound mystery, the question that echoes in the space you leave behind. What do they actually feel deep down in the complex, often contradictory layers of their psyche when you are definitively, irrevocably no longer there to fulfill that specific, perhaps essential psychological function for them? Some will undoubtedly express genuine sadness, authentic disappointment, mourning the loss of a real, albeit perhaps flawed, connection. Others might quickly defensively fill themselves with simmering resentment, over anger, perhaps even vindictive plotting, blaming you entirely for their discomfort, their instability, their pain. But the deeper truth, Jung might suggest the truth beneath the surface noise of reactivity, is that often, perhaps most often, they don't truly know what they feel, because the void you leave behind the space once occupied by your specific function often has no easily definable shape, no readily available label within their conscious awareness. It's not a simple, clean pain they can readily identify, diagnose and treat. It's not a neat, contained wound they can easily bandage and allow to heal. It's something more visceral, more primal, more deeply existentially unsettling. It's the haunting, persistent echo of the dependencies they never acknowledged, the projections they never recognized, the unacknowledged truths about themselves they never wanted to admit, now reverberating, perhaps deafeningly, in the sudden, uncomfortable, terrifying silence of your absence. What truly goes on in their minds in the hidden chambers of their unconscious when you make the autonomous, sovereign decision to leave, to choose yourself, to prioritize your own path? What hidden shadows within them, what sleeping dragons, what buried fears do you inadvertently, perhaps powerfully awaken simply by removing your familiar, predictable presence from their psychic landscape? And perhaps most importantly, most intriguingly, why does that seemingly simple, personal decision to step away, to prioritize your own needs, your own well-being, your own authenticity appear to hold so much latent psychological power? Why does it often create so much internal noise, profound turmoil, defensive resistance, and sometimes even outright panic within their souls? Today, we are not going to merely skim the surface talking about the easy, superficial, socially acceptable aspects of relationship endings, breakups, or departures. We are deliberately, consciously choosing not to stay on the comfortable, predictable surface level. Instead, we are going to courageously, perhaps uncomfortably, explore what really happens psychologically beneath the surface performance when you decide to strategically, authentically step away, what others genuinely truly feel, even perhaps especially if they cannot articulate it, even if they vehemently deny it, what they desperately try not to say, what truths they suppress, what intricate, often unconscious defense mechanisms they immediately employ to hide their vulnerability, their dependence, their fear, and above all, why that seemingly simple personal act of withdrawal, of choosing your own path, possesses the profound, almost uncanny ability to lay bare the darkest, most hidden, most carefully guarded corners of their own complex, often unexamined psychology. Get ready, brace yourself, because this will likely not be a comfortable, soothing journey. There are no easy, simplistic answers here, no comforting, feel-good platitudes that will magically soothe all discomfort or resolve all ambiguity. There are likely truths ahead, psychological insights that will inevitably make you uneasy, perhaps deeply challenging your own cherished assumptions about relationships, loyalty, dependency, and even yourself. This is fundamentally necessarily a journey into the often murky, shadowed depths of human emotions, into the complex, often treacherous zones of projection, transference, dependence, codependency, and the intricate, often unconscious dynamics that most people instinctively, perhaps wisely for their own comfort, prefer to avoid confronting directly. But if you are here, if you are still listening, still engaged, it is likely because something deep, resonant, perhaps even urgent within you already knows, senses the profound truth embedded within this exploration. The act of consciously, courageously stepping away doesn't just potentially transform your life, liberate your soul, it often profoundly, irrevocably shakes the very foundations of the inner world, the psychological reality of those individuals who, consciously or unconsciously, don't yet know how to fully authentically exist, how to find their own center without the specific, perhaps limiting, perhaps enabling role you played for them. And that intricate, often unsettling, profoundly revealing dynamic is the real deep mystery we are now setting out together to unravel. When you make the conscious, definitive, often difficult decision to step away, whether from a romantic relationship that has become toxic or stagnant, a friendship that feels one-sided, or draining a family dynamic steeped in dysfunction and unspoken resentments, or even a specific limiting role you've habitually played within a group or system, something psychologically fascinating, predictable, yet endlessly curious invariably happens within those individuals left behind. In the wake of your departure, people almost immediately, almost reflexively, begin to reconstruct a narrative about you, about your reasons for leaving, about the entire history of your connection. But crucially, fundamentally, this emerging, often rapidly solidifying narrative is rarely, if ever, an objective, balanced, nuanced account of who you really are, in all your authentic complexity, your strengths and weaknesses, your light and shadow. Instead, it becomes primarily, almost exclusively, a story, meticulously crafted, consciously or unconsciously, about who you were specifically in their lives, filtered through the lens of their needs, their expectations, their projections, and perhaps more importantly, more revealingly, it becomes a profound reflection of what they perceive, they lose with your absence, what function you served, what void you filled. It's as if they desperately, almost frantically try to fill the gaping, uncomfortable void left by your departure, not with genuine, compassionate understanding of your perspective, not with honest self-reflection about their own role in the dynamic, but with hastily, defensively constructed versions of you, sometimes idealized beyond recognition, sometimes demonized into a caricature of villainy, or often simply profoundly misunderstood through the distorting prism of their own unresolved issues, versions that you looking from the outside likely wouldn't even recognize as remotely resembling yourself. They begin often obsessively, sometimes compulsively, to reinterpret your past actions through this new biased lens of absence and perceived abandonment. They meticulously analyze your past words, dissect your silences, scrutinize your choices from afar, desperately, anxiously looking for signs, patterns, hidden meanings, clues, anything, absolutely anything really, that might help them explain, rationalize, make sense of your decision in a way that conveniently fits within their existing worldview, their established narrative, their preferred self-image. But here lies the subtle, insidious psychological trick, the self-protective maneuver. What they are really seeking in this often frantic, sometimes distorted analysis is not genuine, objective understanding of you, your motives, your experience. Their primary, often deeply unconscious motivation is to justify themselves, to protect their own fragile ego from the potential pain of self-recrimination, to maintain their own sense of reality, their own perceived righteousness in the face of your destabilizing paradigm-challenging departure. Your leaving threatens their story, so they must rewrite your story to preserve theirs. Your absence, your deliberate withdrawal inevitably, unavoidably forces them to confront, however unwillingly, however defensively, a question they likely never wanted to consciously, honestly ask themselves before. How much of my own perceived emotional stability, my sense of self-worth, my daily functioning, my very identity actually perhaps dangerously depended on this person's presence, their validation, their energy, or the specific, perhaps limiting role they played in my life? And that raw, vulnerable, terrifying question for many individuals, particularly those lacking a strong inner core or deep self-awareness, is simply psychologically unbearable. Because in their often carefully, painstakingly constructed quest to project an image of strength, independence, self-sufficiency, control, they are suddenly, starkly, perhaps humiliatingly forced to acknowledge something deeply human, universally true, yet often profoundly uncomfortable, even shameful in our hyper-individualistic culture. They likely depended on you, relied on you, perhaps even unconsciously used you, far more deeply, far more fundamentally, than they were ever willing, or perhaps even psychologically able to consciously admit, even especially to themselves. And do you know what frequently, almost predictably happens next as a powerful unconscious defense mechanism against this deeply uncomfortable ego-threatening realization of their own hidden dependency, their own vulnerability. They begin often unconsciously, yet sometimes with surprising speed and conviction, to transform their perception of you. Not necessarily because you have fundamentally changed as a person in your absence, but because they desperately need to construct a version of your departure, a narrative about why you left that is psychologically bearable, manageable, less threatening for them. Some might unconsciously, perhaps nostalgically, begin to idealize you in retrospect, suddenly conveniently painting you in glowing, almost saintly terms, almost as if your absence itself somehow magically elevates you, makes you more valuable, more significant, more irreplaceable than you perhaps ever were perceived to be when you were readily, predictably present. They were the only one who truly understood me. I was a fool. I didn't realize how much I needed them, how much they did for me until they were gone. This post-departure idealization, while seemingly flattering on the surface, often serves a complex psychological purpose. It amplifies their sense of loss and regret, justifying their current pain, but also subtly conveniently absolves them of any significant responsibility for the relationship's demise or their own contribution to the dynamic that led to your departure. It wasn't their fault, it was simply the tragic loss of someone irreplaceable. Others, conversely, perhaps those with more fragile egos or a greater tendency towards externalizing blame, might instinctively, almost reflexively, resort to demonizing you. They convince themselves and often actively try to convince others within their social circle that your leaving was an inherently selfish act, a callous betrayal, a profound character flaw, a definitive sign of your fundamental inadequacy, instability, or even malice. They only ever cared about themselves, and they just couldn't handle commitment, responsibility, reality. They were always unstable, toxic, negative. This narrative, however distorted or unfair, serves a crucial protective psychological function for them. By casting you unequivocally as the villain, the problem, the source of all negativity, it allows them to completely avoid confronting their own contributions to the dynamic, their own shortcomings, or the painful vulnerability, the gaping void that your absence exposes within them. It's often psychologically far easier, far less threatening to furiously blame you than to courageously, honestly admit that your autonomous decision, your act of self-preservation fundamentally destabilized their emotional world, shattered their comfortable illusions, or exposed their hidden dependencies. The truly fascinating part of this complex, often messy psychological aftermath is observing how these emotional reactions — denial, idealization, demonization, confusion, anger, sadness, fear — rarely emerge uniformly or predictably. People react in completely different, often revealing ways, depending precisely on what symbolic role you represented within the intricate, often unconscious landscape of their individual psychic lives. For some, perhaps those for whom you represented a primary source of security or validation, your absence might feel like a fresh, gaping open wound, triggering deep-seated, perhaps primal fears of abandonment, inadequacy, or annihilation. For others, perhaps those for whom you mirrored a disowned part of themselves, your departure might feel more like an old familiar wound, one they thought had long since healed and scarred over, but that your unexpected distance suddenly painfully inexplicably reopens, bringing dormant pain flooding back to the surface. And for a select few, perhaps those most heavily defended against their own inner lives, those most reliant on external structures for their sense of self, your absence becomes primarily terrifyingly a stark, unwelcome mirror, relentlessly, mercilessly reflecting back their greatest, most deeply buried, most fiercely denied fear. The terrifying existential prospect of being truly, utterly alone with themselves, stripped bare of external validation, comforting distractions, or the convenient projection screen your presence once provided. This right here is where the real, profound psychological complexity lies. It's not simply that others react emotionally to your departure. It's how those reactions often subtly, unconsciously change, morph, and evolve over time, revealing deeper layers of their own inner world. Initially, as mentioned, there might be palpable shock, anger, confusion, perhaps even desperate manipulative attempts to regain contact, to re-establish control, to pull you back into the old dynamic. But as time inevitably passes, as the immediate emotional shockwaves begin to subside, as the raw wound begins to scar over or fester beneath the surface, your absence often becomes something much more abstract, more symbolic, morphing into a lingering, perhaps haunting question mark within their psyche. They might begin to genuinely, perhaps melancholically wonder if they ever really knew you at all, or if they were merely consistently, perhaps even exclusively, projecting onto you the qualities, the needs, the expectations, the fantasies that they wanted or needed to see, blinding themselves to your authentic reality. And that dawning, unsettling doubt, that fundamental questioning of their own past perceptions, their own judgment, their own role in the dynamic, is often what can truly profoundly consume them psychologically in the long run, leading either to potential growth or deeper entrenchment in denial. Because your departure, your conscious choice to step away, ultimately isn't just a simple physical event, a mere logistical change in their daily lives. It is far more significantly, profoundly symbolic. It represents a fundamental, often unwelcome change in a familiar dynamic, a decisive shift in an established relational system, a disruption of a predictable pattern that they likely did not consciously control, perhaps did not anticipate, and perhaps certainly did not desire. And any perceived loss of control, especially in matters of deep emotional connection, attachment, or dependency, almost invariably universally generates underlying, often profound anxiety. Do you know what is perhaps most ironic, most tragically common in all of this complex, often painful psychological aftermath? That many times, perhaps most times, the individuals left behind in the wake of your departure don't even consciously understand why your decision to step away, to choose yourself, affects them so profoundly, so disproportionately. In their conscious, rationalizing minds, perhaps you weren't that crucial, perhaps you didn't occupy such a significant place in their day-to-day functioning. Perhaps they tell themselves and others that they are fine, that your absence doesn't really matter. But your departure, your absence, the sudden void, powerfully, undeniably reveals, often through their intense emotional reactions or subsequent behavioral changes, that you likely occupied far more psychological space, served a far more critical unconscious function than they were ever willing, or perhaps even psychologically able to consciously admit, even especially to themselves. It's as if your sudden, perhaps unexpected absence acts like a powerful, unforgiving spotlight, unexpectedly harshly illuminating the hidden structural cracks within their own carefully constructed emotional edifice, the unacknowledged vulnerabilities, the denied dependencies, the areas of profound neglect or arrested development they had always managed, perhaps brilliantly, perhaps desperately, to successfully hide, perhaps even from their own conscious awareness, often by projecting them onto you or using your presence as a stabilizing counterbalance, and ultimately the intense, often confusing, seemingly disproportionate feelings they experience, the searing anger, the profound sadness, the bewildering confusion, the simmering resentment, the gnawing anxiety, are often not truly fundamentally about you, the person who left. They are far more profoundly, far more revealingly about what your distance, your absence, forces them unwillingly, uncomfortably, perhaps terrifyingly to confront within themselves. There is something profoundly, almost unsettlingly revealing, almost like a psychological litmus test, about how your simple, personal, autonomous act of stepping away, of choosing yourself, of prioritizing your own path can inadvertently become a kind of psychological trial by fire for the relationships, the connections, the very systems you leave behind, often perhaps far more often than we consciously realize or care to admit. Your absence lays bare an uncomfortable, fundamental, often unspoken truth, that many human connections, even seemingly close, intimate, long-standing ones, are not primarily purely based on unconditional love, deep mutual respect, shared values, or authentic resonance. Instead, they are often complexly, intricately interwoven with unspoken conveniences, subtle, often unconscious power dynamics, unacknowledged, often unhealthy dependencies, and a vast tangled web of unspoken, often unmet needs and projected expectations. And when you make the autonomous sovereign decision to consciously, deliberately break those often invisible yet incredibly strong dynamics, people don't just lose a person from their lives, they often, perhaps more significantly, lose a crucial support system, a familiar, predictable point of reference, a delicate, perhaps precarious balance, that you perhaps entirely unknowingly, perhaps resentfully, yet compliantly, help them maintain, often at significant cost to your own well-being. So here comes the challenging, perhaps even confronting question that few people truly want to ask themselves honestly, especially when reflecting on past relationships or dynamics. What is genuinely left of them when you're no longer there to play that specific role, fulfill that specific function, carry those specific projections, absorb that specific energy? For some individuals, perhaps those possessing a stronger, more integrated core sense of self, those who have done their own inner work, the answer might be relatively simple, albeit perhaps still painful. They adapt. They grieve the loss authentically, perhaps. They find other connections, other sources of support, other ways to meet their needs. They move on, ultimately recalibrating their lives, their sense of self to accommodate your absence, perhaps even learning valuable lessons in the process. But for others particularly, those whose sense of self, whose emotional stability, whose very identity was deeply, perhaps pathologically intertwined with the specific role you played for them, your departure leaves a profound, gaping, terrifying void they genuinely, desperately don't know how to fill. Because your presence, however unconsciously, however burdensome it may have been for you, had somehow, somewhere along the way, become the essential anchor for something much bigger, much more fundamental, much more fragile within their own psychological structure. Something that now begins to dangerously, perhaps catastrophically crumble without your stabilizing, containing, perhaps even enabling influence. And the truly fascinating part, the part that underscores the profound, often invisible interconnectedness, the intricate dance of projection and dependency within human experience, is how in the end this entire experience of stepping away, of choosing absence, inevitably profoundly impacts both sides of the equation. It's not just that they feel the complex, often tumultuous repercussions of your absence. You also inevitably, unavoidably feel the consequences, the shifts, the potential guilt, the profound liberation, the necessary recalibration stemming from your own autonomous, courageous, perhaps long overdue decision. But that perhaps the intricate journey of the one who chooses to leave is another deep, complex story for another time. Today, our primary focus remains resolutely on them, on deciphering, understanding, perhaps even compassionately witnessing what your departure genuinely truly triggers within their minds, their hearts, their souls, their lives. And believe me when I emphasize with unwavering certainty, grounded in psychological observation, that impact, that echo of your absence is often far deeper, far more complex, far more psychologically significant, far more revealing of their inner landscape than it might ever appear on the chaotic, often misleading surface of their immediate reactions or pronouncements.